when our next speaker first began to bombard our office, endless phone calls, letters, email, demanding to be put on the roster, I wasn't persuaded. So I went off and I did a little research, and one of the first things I found out, shocking things that I found out, is this guy doesn't have much of a formal education. You know, we all have friends or acquaintances who didn't manage to put in that final thesis and haven't quite got the doctorate, or maybe they dropped out of college. This guy didn't get out of grade 9. But luckily enough, he fell in on an industry where there weren't many standards, actually, broadcasting. And then he went on to do pretty good, actually. Peter Jennings. Peter, we haven't quite decided what Peter's going to do, so I'm going to sit in here in case he wants to chat, or
troublemaker,
or he's just going to tell us where he's coming from or where he's going to, because we only have a few precious hours.
Where's the Beaujolais?
Where is the Beaujolais? Ross? Jennifer?
I was thinking of the fear factor. You're true in one respect. I was actually asked by Richard Saul Werman, who a lot of you know, to go to a TED conference. I almost did a book with Richard once on the 10 great challenges for the new century. I wisely chose not to do it. But to be honest, while I didn't quite bombard you, I probably should have, because I really wanted to be among Canadians. One of the things I noticed about Canadians, we're not very clannish. And yet, inevitably when we meet, all those old cliches about, do you know such and such, come true. I remember going to the Players Club in New York many years ago. I never met Donald Sutherland walking into the room, and I saw him at the other side of a very crowded room, and he saw me at the other end, and we just knew instantly that we were two Canadians. But being Canadian, of course, we'd never walk over and say hello to each other. And just happened to bump into each other as we were leaving after the party, and then of course walked 60 or 70 blocks in the freezing cold telling Canadian jokes, only one of which I can remember, and I'm not sure it wasn't originally a Polish joke. Canadian goes to Harvard and is a little lost on the campus the first day and goes up to a Harvard man and says, "Can you tell me where the library's at?" And the Harvard man says, "You know something? You must be from Canada." He said, "You know, at Harvard, we do not end sentences in a preposition." Canadians thinks for a second, says, "Oh, I'm really sorry. Can you tell me where the library's at, asshole?" I must tell you also, I haven't got the vaguest bloody idea why I'm here beyond that. And I took, it's kind of unfair in a way, because I took Moses at his word. I wrote it down. Don't prepare anything. Come to be knowledge enhanced. Let your soul be stretched, or your imagination. Be the master of all subjects and the victim of none. So I didn't prepare. Then on the plane last night, I got a bit nervous. So I began to look at who the other participants were, and I thought at first I might figure out what we had in common. Molly Johnson, originally from the Infidels, was a little difficulty finding out precisely what we had in common, except that we both started in the Imperial Room of the Royal York Hotel in Toronto. My father, by way of a little background, was one of the early pioneers of Canadian broadcasting. We had these television sets in our house, though only Moses was smart enough to collect them. And I began my career at the CBC as a summer replacement announcer, because none of the announcers wanted to do, in those days we had all the dance band shows, and none of these guys wanted to work at night, and so I was the summer relief guy who went, and every Thursday night on the Dominion Network of the CBC said, from the beautiful Imperial Room in the Royal York Hotel overlooking gorgeous downtown Lake Ontario, the CBC presents Moxie Whitney and his orchestra. My first adventure in broadcasting. I was very curious to hear Michael Adams, and I've already got one story idea, and we were talking a little bit earlier about this whole notion of convergence between the United States and Canada. I'm one of those, I've always stayed a Canadian, but I have had a glorious time in the United States and have become impatient in recent years with the inherent Canadian nationalistic approach that everything about the United States is wrong. And I was reminding Michael this morning that for all of the convergence that's occurring on both the northern and on the southern frontier, while I admire the heartfelt, long-held determination to retain that which we individually think is the best of Canada, the kind of anti-Americanism that was in my mother's milk, I think no longer has any particular place in the dialogue, at least. It's interesting, we were talking about de Tocqueville, or Tocqueville as he's referred to by politicians in the United States today. There's no other writer in the whole history of the American Republic other than the Founding Fathers who have had such a grasp on the American self-image. Tocqueville, young French aristocrat, came to the United States or came to America in the 1830s. And I was surprised reading him, he'd actually come to Canada. Also very briefly, stepped briefly across the border and instantly grasped the differences between us, in that Canadians were building houses closer together. They were more expensive than American houses even then. And we're very interested in putting down roots and establishing communities whereas Americans were forever in the process of destroying that which they'd created themselves, and in many cases what their parents had created, and moving on. And it's encouraging and interesting to go around the world today and find any number of Canadians who have at least adopted that great sense, or Canadians who've adopted that great sense of adventure. Now the other, yeah, sure, anytime. I wish you would.
You remember a little while ago, you were quoted as saying in a speech that Americans just didn't give Canada a second thought. And I was curious if you could chat a little bit about the puzzle of the Canadian brand in the United States, because you are the premier television news star in the United States.
A word I resent deeply.
And we know about, Jim Carrey, and we celebrate Celine Dion. So whether it's rock and roll or the movies or television, some of the premier icons in America are Canadians and are applauded by Americans, and have done spectacularly well. But when you say the word Canada in the United States, they laugh.
Oh, I think it's changing. I mean, I think the North American Free Trade Agreement has made an enormous difference in terms of the appreciation for the potential of continentalism. Growing up in Canada, we're all obliged, because we come from a smaller place, to understand influence rather than power. Americans grow up with this sense of power and dominance in the world, and it was really interesting to hear Michael talk about the whole business of cultural convergence in the world in terms of whether it becomes Americanization, or in the case of my company, Disneyization, which terrifies some people. I think Americans are actually becoming more appreciative of Americans. One thing about George W. Bush is that I think he understands, not to mention proves on occasion, the need to be humble in foreign policy. He had an interesting, I was overseas last week while the president was there, and it was interesting to see the Europeans just laying for him, just as Canadians would before he got there. And yet by the end of the week, they had judged him simply because he'd taken a reasonably humble, inclusive, let's consult approach. I'm not sure he means it. There was a whole new cast, and of course a lot of this has to do with media manipulation. One of the other things I actually wanted to say about the media was, because you can't see them very well, but I'm not a techie. I mean, I tried to call my wife this morning on my cell phone here, I tried to call my office. I keep getting this guy named Sultan in Toronto, who's now got 18 messages on his email. But one of the things I deeply appreciate about coming home is that in Ontario you teach television literacy. And though Joe, I don't think, will appreciate me saying it, what they're doing with the Wales notion, he actually said it at the end of his observation. He said, what the media sometimes do is shift emotional reaction into political action. That's exactly what he's trying to do. He's trying to get us to save the whales and understand the environment. But if you notice how he does it, and again, I don't mean this in any offensive way, it's just the reality of communication in some respects. He slows down the film, watches the whales in anything but real time, or much less than real time, and puts in this gorgeous music behind, which is irresistible to us and plays on our emotions all the time. One of the things I hope Canadians will actually never lose is this teaching of literacy, which we do not have in the United States. So that kids have at least the potential in Canadian, Ontario schools at least, to come out knowing how we're going to screw with their minds in the not too distant future. And it's the, consumer beware in the greatest respect. I also wanted to talk just a little bit. I wrote down what Norman Jewison said, I'm old and out of it and I shouldn't be here. I'm disappointed to hear that we couldn't ask questions because I have spent 40 years in the business going through life without opinions, or at least no public opinions. One of the great difficulty of being the anchor person is you're not allowed essentially to have, you don't want, you're allowed, but you exhibit your personal, public, political, social, ideological opinions at your peril because it's the one job in mainstream television news, I work in mainstream television news, which is really the conveyor belt of other people's ideas. And yet, and as I looked this morning, I realized how much and how extraordinary this career has been for me in terms of having the kind of opportunity that school would never produce. I keep telling them, I've got two kids, 19 and 21, who are, one who loves university, one who can't stand it. And I have such a hard time telling my kid to stay in college, even though I know how real it is because their dad got out at grade 9 and had this extraordinary career. Joe was talking about diving. I spent last week in the Middle East because one of my absolute passions is that we try to get religion and spirituality into the public arena in a greater way. And so I'm doing a documentary about the life of St. Paul, and I went to Caesarea, halfway between Haifa and Tel Aviv, and to the Roman underwater ruins, which is when not many people know the Paul story. See, when Paul is arrested by the Romans in Jerusalem, he's sent to Caesarea and ultimately on to Rome to argue his case. And in 600 yards offshore in Caesarea, the Romans, who discovered not just cement, but vulcanized cement, putting lava ash together, putting it in the water and seeing it harden, built this extraordinary port. And what you realize in a place like this, and I must say one of the frustrations for me in not being here for the whole thing, is that how communications in the first century enabled the transport of ideas. It's how Christianity moved out of Asia Minor and in the Middle East and on into Europe. And within 400 years was the official religion of the Roman Empire, which was then called the Holy Roman Empire, of course, even though more Christians were killed after it became the official religion than there were before. So that's one of the really, truly exciting things to be here. I want to talk also a little bit about technology and me. A lot of you here, I know, come to celebrate the interchange between technology and information. I actually think it's bad for journalism in many ways, or it's very tough for journalism. When I was a young reporter in the Middle East in the early 1970s, first of all, I had a lot more freedom. In those days, we were not compelled to make money in the news division. One of the great tragedies, I think, of modern broadcasting is that news divisions were discovered to make money, and therefore we became a profit center. And now in the Disney world, we're equal to Imagineering and 101 Dalmatian puppies. It's sad, it is sort of funny in a tragic sort of way. But for many, many years, even in American commercial television, the notion of a lost leader, which existed and still exists in the CBC, was very much alive. And then technology came along and utterly changed our reporting lives. When I was, as I said, a young reporter in the Middle East, they'd asked me to go to Egypt and do a situationer on what was going on. What's going on in Egypt today? I did it 2 or 3 times a year, and you'd get off in Cairo and you'd go downtown, call up a couple of journalist friends, maybe call up a minister in the Egyptian government, wander around town, get a feel for the people, get in a felucca and go up the Nile, naturally searching for opinions of Egyptians, have a couple of, have a cup
Parasol.
under the
With the
parasol,
Beaujolais.
have it with the Beaujolais. Actually, wine was very hard to get. You had to bribe an African diplomat in Egypt in order to get good wine, because the Egyptians make the worst wine in the world. But naturally, I was on an expense account. It was always, feast for African ambassador. And after 3 or 4 days of, the kind of reporting that is so valuable to all of us, which is cultural and economic absorption, you'd go and you'd write a piece and you'd send it to New York. We were on film in those days. Now imagine the CNN reporter today, or the Fox reporter, or the City TV reporter arriving in Cairo. The nearest motel, because they have motels near the airport in Cairo, is like several hundred yards away. And everybody's got technological hookup. You go out and you plug your satellite dish in, and you get on the microphone and you begin to talk. And so for all of the sensational capacity that the new technology has enabled us to go places and see things in real time, for reporters it's made it unbelievably hard, because we've lost all this vital time to do the reporting which allegedly helps us to understand the situation in the first place. The other issue is, of course, customizing the news. I couldn't work the computers out there this morning either. Though as a middle-aged man, I love the internet because it's such a source of fabulous resource. I'm forever getting in trouble on my own broadcast because I'm still on the net looking at one more thing or trying to talk to one more goat before the deadline occurs. But a guy in the plane last night said to me, isn't this great? We can customize news to suit ourselves. I think it's horrendous, because it simply means that if you are, and we're all selfish about our own interests, if you are predisposed to the idea that you only want to read the stock market and get the sports, and you customize your news, which you get on your computer, and before long, thanks to Moses and other people, you'll be able to get, customized on your television screens. It locks us out to so much of the rest of the world, and so the great explosion in media is enormously and difficultly challenging for us. I don't quite know where you want to go next, but you said you wanted to poke, so go ahead, poke. I feel better.
I'm interested to know where you're going next. You're on your way somewhere.
Well, I'm the last anchor person in the country at the moment who still has a contract which enables him to do documentaries. And the long form in television has been desperately squeezed, both by economics and by the general tendency of either the audience's attention span to be reduced naturally, or, God knows, with our contribution to reducing it. So I'm currently working on a documentary about simplicity. It's interesting. One of the things that I'd love to talk to Michael about sometime in terms of the parental, I think there's a whole morning just in the parental authority issue in the United States. It has a lot to do, I think, with the fact that we haven't had a woman president of the United States, and a man still occupies the principal bully pulpit in the country. I think it's a tremendous frustration in the United States at the moment, because there is an inherent struggle in the United States between central power and regional power. It's reflected in the 10th Amendment of the Constitution in terms of state rights. It's been there ever since the founding fathers, and it's a normal struggle in political life, which is, I think, manifest to some extent in the public arena to the nth degree, and therefore I'm not surprised. This country also beset with social problems of far greater magnitude than Canada, of race and of drugs. I suppose the one thing I come away with, if I had to leave tomorrow, the one thing I take away from the United States would always be this extraordinary burden of race, and the breakdown of parental and male authority, perhaps, in many of the minority households in the country. So, Michael, I promise you, we'll do a story about this, I know, which will relieve you. It means you will get access to the television that you were seeking for those of us who watch it. But it'd be very interesting to take this much, much farther. I'm also working on a documentary on prescription drugs, one of the great scandals of modern day life, what the prescription drugs industries do in terms of manipulating our minds. If you watch the evening news these days, you'll see that we have a lot of prescription drug commercials. And it reflects the graying of our audience and the general graying of the baby boomer generation. I'm also trying to do AIDS. One of the things I was really admired to hear about Molly was that she does so much work for the international AIDS community. Here's an example of how tough it is to get something into the public arena until you find a personality. I recognize and admire in many ways the sort of personality quotient of City TV and much else of what you do. But until we discovered this tiny South African boy, Nkosi Johnson, the 11-year-old who spoke at the World AIDS Conference in Johannesburg several years ago, and until we sent a reporter and began to do his life and then followed his life, it was extraordinarily hard to translate the AIDS crisis, not only in Africa, but in Russia and India and China, where they've just admitted it for the first time, in the United States. So I'm very interested in the convergence of prescription drugs and cures. We're not searching for a cure for AIDS very vigorously in the United States because the AIDS community, largely the gay community, has found extended life with protease inhibitors. And so the real emphasis there is to extend life rather than to find a prevention to AIDS. And so all of that is, for me,
Did you know it's Gay Pride Week?
fascinating.
Toronto?
No, but I think it's Gay Pride Week everywhere, somewhere.
Big parade this Sunday.
Well, there's an interesting challenge for television to always find out how much we evolve. I can't remember the first Gay Pride parade I ever covered, but as a sort of establishment, older, square reporter, you had to make the decision about what images you were going to put on television. And there's always someone in every community, gay community included, who wants very much to shock. And our call is how does television move? In some respects, you could probably see how television has moved in the last 10 or 15 years in terms of the acceptance of the gay pride parades and what gets on television and what does not.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Proliferation of characters and so on. Did you want to add something?
No, I
No?
mean,
How are we
I'm
doing
like
with your time? I'm concerned about your time.
I want to just say terribly sorry that one of the things I did hope that I would be able to stay and talk to folks. The difficulty was that I was on the road all last weekend, so they would not let me stay today. And there's nothing happening in the world today, which is even more depressing. So I have to go back and do it. But I did have a one.
Stay through the first break?
Oh, absolutely, and
Yep.
I have to tell you, in terms of making connections with other people, I met Hani Rashid's mother here tomorrow. You have no idea how lucky you are. Hani Rashid, the architect, is here. And it gives you a chance to talk not only to him about what his contemporary stuff is, but what happened in terms of the artistic development in Egypt, where some of the great architects have emerged. You should go and look at, I wrote his name down so I would be sure to propagandize on his behalf. Simon Bell's 3D photographs in the lobby are absolutely fabulous. Cool. So I'm almost embarrassed, so I say thank you for inviting me. I apologize I haven't stayed, and I'm glad I got something out of it so far.
That's swell.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter.